All right. Welcome, Mike. I'm
Welcome,
Joel. This is
Joel.
Mike. We're your co-hosts for the day. Welcome to the Hero's Journey. In this episode, we're going to talk about grief. Grief can show up in many different ways, and obviously, the most overt or general way that people associate grief with is when something happens to yourself or a family member. For example, someone might pass away or pass on. And we go through that grieving process. What we've both experienced and what we're experiencing, a lot of people around us are asking us about, and also it's coming up a lot in the world at the moment, is grief around um, transitioning, grief around loss of lifestyle in terms of, for example, some of the mandates and bits and pieces that came through. A lot of people obviously chose not to go down that track, and then were all of a sudden ostracized from society, and we're grieving that. It sounds like little things, but it was some massive changes for people around the world. Also grieving the loss of lifestyle, as I just mentioned, never being the same again, but also not being able to unsee certain things. I think a lot of people are have been questioning elements of the system at the moment, and how things are set up. And there's a whole, in New Zealand here, there's a whole election process underway, and it's just very, very emotional and very heightened. People really seem to be quite engaged, which is interesting. That's one positive out of it, is people are quite engaged in that process at the moment. But there's also a lot of emotional trauma, anger, grief around that people were struggling to deal with. So I think the key today is we're just going to share a few examples of what we've been through, but also, I think, Mike, it's really important to give people some practical ways to deal with that, and to sort of ground themselves and to come back into a sense of balance. Because otherwise, like I can share, and I will share later on, as recently, as when I let some grief go, and when you've done, it's quite a powerful experience and quite a freeing experience, but intense experience at the same time, and
It's
we choose to
confronting.
confronting, yeah. We either
Mm,
choose to carry it like a bloody backpack with a 16 kg kettlebell in it on our backs, or we
mm.
can let it go. And the change that it brings is massive. Like, I know, for example, having done a bit of work in that space just this week, I just feel completely different, in terms of balance. For me, it's balance. Like a certain topic was sort of out of balance, and now all of a sudden I can see it with a different perspective. So yeah. So do you want to give us a little bit of a either scenario that you've been through around the grief, or someone that's popped up recently asked you about grief, or shared grief, and how you've helped them deal with it?
Yeah, so if we go macro for a minute,
Mm,
with what you just kind of covered, and we look at what's happened in the last 3 years, we've had a massive, I mean, it's been challenging for people on all levels. Families have been divided, there's been limited ability to travel, there's been control mechanisms placed on people.
mm,
Medical systems are failing, not able to see people. Decisions people have
mm,
made in that area have hurt themselves or other loved ones that they know. We
mm.
have inflation hitting all-time highs. People are
Yeah,
struggling financially.
yeah,
Um, and if we look at what's really happening, we're
mm,
watching the shift of the power structure globally from the
mm,
west to
mm,
the east, essentially. So if we
mm,
go right out like that, and Ray Dalio has a really good YouTube clip on the change of an empire,
mm,
the
mm,
fall and change of an empire. So this is not a new thing. This
mm,
is this has happened for ages and ages,
mm.
centuries, centuries.
Yeah,
This empire's passed its expiry date essentially, and so
mm,
whenever there is a shift in the power structure and the change, there's turmoil. There
yeah,
always is
yeah,
turmoil, and unfortunately, in that process, a lot of people get hurt.
mm,
On many
mm,
different levels,
yeah,
and so that's kind of from an overarching perspective what we're
mm,
watching actually happen.
yeah. And
And then depending on which, yeah, go, yeah,
well, I was just saying, I was thinking about it the other day. On one side of it, touch wood, I'm grateful that, as empires change, and I mean, this is not always the case because there's obviously a war going on right now, but I'm grateful
yeah,
that I'm living in a part of the world where, I don't wake up to some group of men riding through on horses, wiping out
yeah,
my village. You know what I mean? Like, so I think
yeah.
we're dealing with a very different. The grief's still there, but it's a lot less violent in our experience anyway so far.
Yeah,
You know,
it shows up in a different form.
it shows up in
It's in
different
a different,
form. That's a good way of putting
100%.
it. Yeah,
And,
yeah,
like, I don't know, for those that say, for example, have been living in the Middle East or Ukraine or anything like that. I
yeah,
mean, it's just like, fuck,
yeah,
they're dealing with like,
and that, yeah,
friction from a
yeah,
very
yeah,
kinetic standpoint, like where
exactly,
it's
yeah,
like in
yeah,
your
yeah,
face
yeah,
like that. So, we're all going through it in our own fashion or form. It just depends on where we are as to how we're affected,
yeah,
100%.
yeah,
And yeah, because of all this and the changes that have happened, from the mechanisms that were put in place 3 years ago in 2020, where, there were global lockdowns and things happening, that traumatized the living shit out of society,
yeah,
like more than most people have actually realized.
yeah,
And that
yeah,
trauma is sitting in people still, and a lot of people haven't dealt with it. So it's kind
yeah,
of sitting in their bodies, it's sitting under the surface, and they have realized, whether it be consciously, as a lot of us have, or subconsciously, that the world's not ever going to be the same again. The genie's out of the bottle, and you can't put that fucker back in there. It's out. And so there's been this, and I went through it myself back in 2020.
yeah,
This massive grieving
yeah,
of the loss of what once was,
yeah,
knowing that
yeah,
that's not coming back again. Like, it's just not.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so you kind of, I didn't realize it at the time. That's what was happening for me, where just felt the stress, and I felt hopeless for a while. There was this feeling of hopelessness and just heaviness.
yeah,
And part of that was the grieving of what was. And
yeah,
it was,
100%.
it was tough. And everyone's got their
Yeah,
different stages and degrees in which they're going through this process.
yeah,
Some like just pushing the off button, and cognitive dissonance is kicking in, and they're holding on for dear life to their version
yeah.
of reality, of the
Which is
old reality, because they can't face it.
well, it's a
And
safety coping
yeah,
mechanism. Whatever,
100%.
however a human reacts is their way to keep themselves safe,
Totally.
right? Yeah.
Totally. And so
Mm,
you can't, again, like, for a
mm,
while there as well, I was like,
mm.
why the hell aren't these people like seeing it? And I'd kind of get
Yeah,
into that space.
yeah, yeah.
But you can't blame them. Like, you've got to
No,
meet people where they're at,
yeah,
and everyone's got,
yeah,
as you just pointed out, the safety mechanism to
yeah.
keep their version and construct of
Oh,
the
yeah.
world, in order to have them feeling like they can get up and do stuff.
Yeah,
So,
quick story on that one. Like when the lockdowns all happened, obviously there's, the tourism market was one of the main ones that got impacted. All of a sudden,
mm-hmm.
pretty much overnight, I lost three of my main, marketing clients, and they're decent sized clients. And I put my head in the sand like an ostrich
Yeah,
for a week, and just put
yeah,
my head in the
yeah, yeah,
sand for a week. And I was just
yeah.
like, what the. And I wouldn't say that was necessarily grief at the time, but that was shock, I think. And then after that, I pulled it out and off we went. And, we formed a plan of action and just made stuff happen, But I think even that is a shock and a grief for people. Some people didn't. They had to shut their business down,
Yeah.
or they were just so rocked that they lost everything. So I think there's a real practical impact of all of those lockdowns as well, as one, being locked up in your home with your family. If you've got little kids, it's hard enough if you don't have a lot of space around you. Then trying to
Yeah.
run a business, and then fear of loss of business, staff issues coming up. The other thing I'd say that you mentioned, which I kind of touched on, was the fact with social media and our phone these days, we see all these external things that are a lot worse than our situation right in our face. Like I remember seeing that lockdown, was it somewhere in China, Shanghai, or somewhere where they locked down millions of people or hundreds of thousands of people in apartments. And there was, I don't know if it was real I mean, who knows these days, but
Yeah, no, you don't
there
know
was
what's propaganda coming out,
people,
or
yeah,
like,
people crying and screaming and stuff. And I remember
yeah.
actually just shedding a tear over that, thinking, holy shit, like, you know,
Yeah, I think some of
that's
them were
just
starving, right? People were starving,
outrageous,
and yeah.
So, all of that grief from external is then added on top of the current situation too,
That's an interesting point you just bring up there. So on that too,
Yeah,
here's the
yeah,
thing. If we look at the anyone that wants to control a population, one of the first things you want to do is divide them.
mm,
Like, divide and conquer. It's been around forever. because united, the people, the masses are then powerful. So you want to divide them. And also the other thing you want to do is put them into fear. Because if you put them into fear, they're no longer using their rational mind. Their prefrontal cortex is shut down and they're easily controlled.
Right.
And so this is exactly what was done. And they knew exactly what they were doing. Hence, there was 3 updates a day, say here in New Zealand, a 1 o'clock, a 4 o'clock, and a 6 o'clock.
Yeah.
Because then people were like, oh God, I've got to, and then they were addicted to watching these updates. That was then driving them and spiraling them down further into fear and then making them easier to control. So yeah, some of the information that was coming out too was definitely designed. It may have been like a lot of it would have been fake, but it was designed to keep the fear and keep people polarized and divided. 100%.
Yeah. Interesting.
So that opens up the next piece of, well, these control structures and who's been in charge. There's a lot of people grieving that, because for a lot of us, we like to think that these people, these constructs that were in charge had our best interests at heart, right? And some of that illusion and veil has now fallen. And now a lot of people are faced with the idea that maybe they don't have our best interests at heart. These people that we've been putting up on these pedestals thinking that they're helping us and they want to look after us, maybe they're actually not. And when you arrive at that point, that's a fucking scary point for a lot of people, because their whole version of reality has been tipped upside down.
Yeah, it's life-changing experience. I went through it probably piece by piece over my life, but I grew up in a church environment. And throughout that journey, I think in that environment, it's a very, very known environment where people put people on a pedestal. You have leaders, and for whatever reason, in any group scenario, that often happens and plays out. I don't mean like sort of in a culty way, but I just mean like, pastor or preacher or whatever. And time after time, I saw those people fall from grace. They call it, make mistakes. But unfortunately, in that environment, well, I mean, there was, how do I say it? There was forgiveness and all that sort of stuff, but it was dramatic falls from grace. And so I had all these sort of bubbles slowly pop for me going, oh, actually the world, or that's not how I thought it was or how I've been told it is. And then going to uni as well, I think for me, that was the big one around the system and structure. Like I remember doing some research into marketing and reading about all the subliminal programming that happened back in the days on TV, to make you buy certain brands and stuff. And I even seen it recently on something I was watching in a sporting environment. I was like, holy crap. Like I paused it and there was a subliminal message. I paused it and sent it to a friend. I was like, can you believe this? Like, I thought that was illegal, but maybe not. I don't know. But
this when we talk about illegal,
it just blows the mind, and I think and then some also around an international global structure that I was ideally looking to kind of angle into. I met a few people who kind of burst some bubbles around that for me as well, and I was just like, man. So I think it's life-changing, absolutely life-changing, and it's really tricky to grapple with that thought, because it's kind of like, well, what is there then? What is there then if that's not?
We'll call it awakening, right? We'll call it awakening to, we've used this term before and it's been used a lot, but it's so poignant, and that's the matrix, like waking to the matrix and the control systems, if you look at it that way. And just on that legal thing, I just have to say this too. I think where things are termed illegal or illegal all depends on who's doing it. It all depends on who's doing it, because let's be honest, there's some areas and groups that are doing shit that if the average punter was doing it, it'd be classed as illegal.
Well, it's sort of like that thing is,
they write the
do
rules
it until you get caught too, right? And who's going to catch, like, at a certain point, who's going to keep people accountable if the accountable bodies kind of, I wouldn't say corrupt, but influenced,
it's been very nice and PC there, Joel.
No, I was reading something the other day and I was just kind of like, far out, like that. accountability body is being influenced. And I can see fact one, fact two, fact three. I'm just kind of like, it's just so obvious. Like, but then who keeps them accountable? I don't
Yeah,
know.
who's
Well, like
policing the
God,
policing
karma, maybe,
agencies? Yeah,
but you just got to
yeah.
trust in that, I suppose.
So
Mm,
if you look at just what we kind of went back to before on
mm.
that process of like kind of having your paradigm shattered, we'll kind of
Mm,
say that's
mm.
what it really is, right?
Yeah, it is.
It's
Yeah.
like this
Yeah.
whole paradigm is shattered,
Mm,
and now we're faced with the unknown, the uncertainty, the
mm,
realization that everything we believed for the majority of our lives is no longer true, and it's like
mm.
fuck. That's kind of what happens, and
Yeah.
at that point, it's painful because again,
Yeah.
at that point, that's where the realization kicks in that A, you've probably
Mm,
been deceived for the majority of your life. No one
mm.
wants to be deceived.
No.
B, the world as you knew it in
Mm,
whatever area context is not what you
mm.
thought it was.
Yeah.
And at that point, you're faced with what now? What now? And then if you've then
Yeah.
gone a little bit further and you have the realization
Yeah.
that it's the opposite of what
Yeah.
you thought it was, now you're faced with the challenge as well of going, God, I've got to deal with that as well. And what
Mm,
is this
mm.
really like? What does this really look like? How the hell do I operate in this area?
Yeah.
And that process can build resentment, anger,
Yeah.
and then ultimately
Yeah.
it can have grief as well. The grief of the loss of your
Oh,
version of reality and world that you
yeah.
thought was once there, that's no longer there because it's
Yeah.
been shattered.
It's
Yeah.
massive. And then fear
Yeah.
and anxiety. Like, so for
Yeah,
me,
totally.
like the more and more that I, um, sort of become aware of,
Mm,
um, I went through a phase where I then became quite fearful and quite anxious. And I think also it's very easy to then jump into the entertainment around that,
yeah.
I suppose, disclosure, for example, for want of a better word. There's all these communities around there, and you call them conspiracy and fact. And I've found in my experience sifting through all that, some of it's very real information. You can go and find that information yourself on official websites, other stuff of
Yeah.
sort of things, and you kind of go, well, I've got no idea if that's real or not. For example, that video I mentioned earlier, like, but I think the point is that it's very easy to then slip into having that grief to deal with, but then also then slipping into fear and anxiety, and
Mm,
then just you know living a life from that space. Like, I think of some actions that I took, which are probably logical and make sense anyway. But I did a little bit of prepping. I got some food and I got water and I got stuff there for my family, which is a practical thing to kind of do. But you know,
totally. Like
uh,
it's a natural thing to want to protect and
yeah,
survive and to
yeah,
and look if you look at, Maslow's hierarchy of
mm,
needs,
mm,
shelter and food is right there. Like
yeah,
we can't do anything else till we have the basics and
mm,
so if you're the caregiver, if you're the provider of a family, it makes
mm,
perfect sense that you're going to
mm.
go and want to like mitigate risk and put things in place to make sure that your family's protected if worst case scenario happens.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, 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 definitely. But I suppose what I mean is some of those. I hear that and I acknowledge that. I think some of I suppose I meet people still now today living in that fear and anxiety space, as
Mm,
opposed to balance going, well, like that Zorro's circle thing I mentioned that I actually picked up from another good mate, which is, you know, I can only control what's in my sphere, direct sphere of
mm,
influence. I can obviously step out of that and have impact in the community, but what can I control around me? And then as soon as I bring myself back into that space and go, well, actually, I can, control what
yeah,
I do on a daily basis, how I look after my family, our
yeah,
exit plan or whatever, some food and water and all that sort of stuff. Then I go, well, I've done what I can do, and
yeah,
that's all I
totally.
can do. And
Yeah.
just got to trust,
And just expanding on
mm,
that, you're
mm,
100% right. Like, at the
mm,
end of the day, we can only control what we can control. And
mm,
there's no point in focusing and having fear or
mm,
focusing on or getting frustrated of. And trust me, I've done this anyway. Like we're all
mm.
human. We all do this shit. So
Yeah.
we slap ourselves out of it. But there's no point in trying to have focus or fear on something that is outside of our control.
Mm,
And on that, this is when we go to the fear factor and we look at that and the mechanism that fear is used for, like why it's used, then our job, what we can control is our inner world, right?
Yeah.
And so then it's making sure that we come back to ourselves and then casting a vision, focus, energy onto what we want to create.
Yeah, nice.
Versus the fear of, and giving energy to the direction that perhaps someone else wants to take us that we don't want. Because
that piece is, can you say that again?
Let me try and reframe that again. So we want to focus on what we want, the outcomes we want, versus the fear that is being used and intentionally created to take us down the avenue that they want. Because they understand how human consciousness works, and thoughts are powerful. Thoughts create, energy creates. And so everything's energy, right? Everything. So wherever we're giving our attention and energy to, life force will flow and it will bring that about. So our job really, outside of the physical constructs of what we can control and our daily actions, is to use this and use spirit and mind and energy to focus on the area and the outcomes that we do want, because then we're being responsible for creating the reality in the world that we want to create. Now, when you get a whole bunch of society doing that together, that is extremely powerful. And this is exactly why they divide us. Because if you had all of society and the masses coming together in that form, focusing on new systems that were about empowerment, systems that were about equality, systems, even though they try and pitch us equality, it's not about equality, but systems that were really looking after everyone, and that where we governed ourselves to a degree, then that would come about way, way faster. So what they do is they invert that, and they pitch to us that that's what they're trying to do for us, but it's not. And they use nice fluff words and things like that. But essentially, they're using the fear still to drive us into a direction that has control mechanisms to take us away and disconnect us from ourselves and others. So our job, I'll just say again, our job outside of the daily actions we can do is to use this and use our heart and life force to put into focusing on a world that we actually want to have.
Yeah, and so that's really, really good. And I think that, how do you then, can you link that then? So to me, that's like light at the end of the tunnel. Conversations gone from talking about, grief, anxiety, all of that stuff, which is quite a dark space to be in. And then as soon as we start talking about taking control, focusing my time, energy, mind power, mental power on what I actually want to create for myself, my family, and my community. You can see that rolling out all around the world. Often the media focuses on negative things. If you go digging and go looking for positive news, there's so much out there. It's phenomenal what people are doing around the world, and they're doing exactly that. They're harnessing their focus, their willpower, their energy on positive impact, and it's phenomenal, how does one
and
move?
why isn't that stuff made really available? Why is it sensitive? Exactly know why, right?
Exactly, because they don't want more of it happening. But I think, how does one move though from that space of grief to that space we just spoke about, where they what are some tools we can give people?
So first of all, man, it's good. First of all, you've got to acknowledge it. Like, this is the thing. Excuse me, a lot of people aren't willing or aren't able or don't know that they're in there. So I hope this conversation sparks that realization for some, that perhaps why they've been feeling off or not feeling right or just angry or resentful or upset is that because this has transpired and they haven't perhaps dealt with it and put it on the table, and it's just been sitting in their subconscious, and in their conscious mind every now and then it'll go up and down, and so they haven't actually gone and owned what's happened for them.
Right.
So owning your shit to start with is the first step. The awareness that something's happened and that you're aware of it, that until it comes into your sphere of awareness, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what you're dealing with. So you first got to have the awareness the insight to have that and then own it.
Yes. Yeah.
And when I say
Wow.
own it, you've got to like fucking go, fuck this.
Oof.
Okay, this is where I'm at. This is where I'm at.
Yeah.
And from there, now
Yeah.
you can start to do something because you're empowered.
Yeah.
But the more you disassociate from, the more you try to bury, you disempower yourself, you gaslight yourself.
Yeah.
And that shit all stores in the body anyway. And so it's still running the show, but you just don't know it's running the show.
Yeah.
So first of all, you've got to pluck it out. You've got to make it yourself aware of it, own the fact that that's where you're at. And then for me with grief, or the resentment, you've got to allow yourself to feel it. Allow yourself to actually feel it and let that move through your nervous system. Let that energy go out of your system. And the only way you do that, which most people don't want to do, is to go fucking lean into it and feel it and let it through. And then from that point, once you've done that, then you can start to change your perceptions. You can start to shift your perception because remember, there is no good without bad. There's no dark without light. There's no negative without positive. Everything's got a full quantum. It's got a full, it's in its entirety, yin yang. So because you've then grieved and you felt the loss of, which is real, like there's been a loss, but there's also at that same point a transformation that takes place where with that loss, there's also gain. And so then it's like shifting. Once you've gone through that grieving and let that shit out, then you start to shift your perception onto, okay, what good is coming from this? What good has come from this? What has this created opportunity-wise for myself?
Yeah.
What can we now do that we've dealt with what was? What can we now create? And then we shift the perception from the loss and focusing on what was to, wow, what can I do? What can I create? How's this served me? And then that to me is the most important process and the actions that you can actually do to shift yourself out of that.
Yeah, definitely. It's so powerful. I'll just share that scenario that we were talking about yesterday for myself when I was actually sort of started the week quite just deflated, really quite flat, almost depressed, that sort of feeling. And, just sort of got on with it and that sort of thing. But I just didn't feel happy. My happiness was kind of gone. And I had, on the weekend, had a realization around, so I think it was just another bubble burst. Like I was kind of spending time in a certain space in the sporting arena where I was just really enjoying and getting into it. And I had just had a few bubbles burst in that space and it kind of really gutted me. But I didn't realize that there were so many emotional ties over the years that I built connected to that. And when that light turned on in that space where I realized, actually, hang on a minute, that's not necessarily how it is. It just sort of gutted me, and I didn't even realize what was going on until sort of 2 or 3 days into it. I asked myself that question, your point, ask what's going on. I stopped and I was like, what's going on, Joel? Why are you feeling like this, And then bang, the answer popped into my head and I was like, oh. And at the time it wasn't that freeing, but the awareness was there all of a sudden in my face and I realized what it was. And I was like, holy crap. And it didn't help me push through the grief. It wasn't until then we, caught up and I could unpack that and just sort of feel that grief. It really has changed my whole perception now, like instantly.
Yeah, man, just on that, I'm going to jump into, because that session we had the other day, for me to expand a little bit without going into too much detail, that for you is fucking confronting, right? Like as I took you in there, because it was in your coaching session, as we went in, you could remember the resistance was there, the anger was there, but the resistance was there to want to go in. But as you went in, and I commend you for this, because it's not easy. It's not easy, really confronting that stuff and then going into it and feeling into it. But once you did, man, that was a huge shift. Like the energy that came up and out of you that had been sitting in there was massive, And then once you did that, you then got to actually step out of that place and we got to shift out. It was quite pivotal. It was really big. So it was massive for me. And just for those that, just a bit of context, like for me it was tied up into my ability, of being
powerful, strong a man, and proving myself and showing my value and validation, and all of that stuff for me was tied up into there, and a bubble was burst in that space, and it's kind of like, holy crap, what now? That was actually the feeling I got, was kind of, what now? What do I was holding on to that and enjoying that, and what now? What do I feel that? And to your point though, the next thing's coming, the more beautiful things coming, the learning's already here. I can share and talk about it, and now I'm kind of going, great, now.
Well, we shift. You realize, right? Because if I'll go into this a little, you had the construct, around also the game that you played, that where it was like, that was a lot of your validation. It was you as a man. It was all these things that you'd pinned and anchored your identity on. And so it made complete sense you felt that way, right? Because it's like, fuck, now I'm questioning all this. Yeah. But what we got to see too, you remember, is that set you up. That was your training. That was your kind of development. And what's happened now, and the role that you're stepping into as a leader, not just for your family, but for your community and for this community, is that it was setting you up to just shift from just purely that physical realm. Yeah. Is that it's just transformed into a different version, a different form, in a different area. And so it's still you, and it's the essence of you that wants to lead and wants to help and wants to do all these things that you did. It's now just showing up in a different place. Yeah. And when we got to that, when we got to that piece, I don't know if you remember, but there was a massive like aha light bulb. Yeah. And that's what I mean about then shifting perceptions. Once you've gone through the grief, it's like, well, hang on, where is this still showing up? Yeah. Where am I able to exhibit these things that I loved in this area that I know no longer can do it in? Yeah. And there is no loss, there's just transformation. And so it's but it's the lack of perception that we have. Yeah. The lack of being able to see it in its entirety. Until we do, and we unlock the other part, we stay kind of stuck in the one-sided. Yeah. But once you get to unlock it all, you're like, fuck, that's where it is. Yeah. 100%. And it's liberating. It's like the light bulb goes on. It's phenomenal. And I think that's sort of my point for people that are listening, that there is the light at the other side of the tunnel. It's not just the awareness and the working through the grief. It's kind of then the realization that actually there is balance in that. And that there's powerful skills and techniques and ability there that can then be applied on a different field or a different sphere in a different space and still get that fulfillment and enjoyment, but it just in a different way. Yeah, it's quite very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, look, this is a great conversation, and I think one that we will continue more so too, like maybe another part to it, because it's a big piece and it affects everyone. Yeah. Like that, everyone's affected by this. So we're going through massive changes. There's no doubt about it. The world's going through massive changes, and the only thing that's going to hamstring you or anyone is the inability to be adaptable. Yeah. So the more willing you are to accept the unknown, the uncertainty, and step into that and be flexible, have behavioral flexibility, and to govern oneself instead of looking externally for someone to take care of you. Yeah. Hence, you are the hero to your own journey. When you fully own that and step into that, now you're a creator. Now 100%. You're a creator, and you're creating your reality consciously and choosing consciously to what you want to create.